Detroit, March 1973. The city outside was holding its breath the way it always did in that thin stretch between winter and spring, where the cold hadn't fully let go and the warmth hadn't fully arrived. A Tuesday night, the kind of night where the few people still out on the street walked fast, heads down, collars up. Inside the Blue Note Lounge on Hastings Street, things were different. The room was small, and it smelled like cigarette smoke and spilled bourbon and the kind of ambition that never quite finds its footing. Maybe 40 seats, most of them taken. A low wooden stage at the far end, a single spotlight throwing a pale yellow circle on the floor. Behind the bar, a man wiped the same glass he'd been wiping for 10 minutes. Not because it wasn't clean, but because his eyes were on the stage. In the corner, away from everyone, a man sat alone. He was wearing a plain dark coat and a knit cap pulled low. No one around him had recognized him, and that was exactly why he'd come. Marvin Gaye did this sometimes. He needed nights like this. Nights where he could sit inside music without anyone needing something from him. No photographer, no A&R man, no Motown executive with a list of things Marvin needed to be. Just a room, a stage, and someone playing. It had been 3 years since Tammy died, 2 years since What's Going On. And somewhere between those two facts, Marvin had gone quiet in a way that scared the people who knew him. Not silent. He still talked, still showed up. But there was a stillness behind his eyes now that hadn't been there before. Like he was watching life from a small distance he couldn't close. He sipped his drink and watched the stage. The young man who walked up was maybe 21. He carried a second-hand Telecaster that had seen better decades, and the look on his face that almost every young musician in Detroit carried back then. That specific mix of hunger and terror that makes people either brilliant or reckless. His name was Jimmy Watkins. He'd been playing every open mic in the city for 2 years, working days at a parts factory on the east side, saving every extra dollar just to keep his amp from being repossessed. Jimmy leaned into the mic and said he was going to play Mercy, Mercy Me. Marvin's hand stopped over his glass. Jimmy played. The chords were right. His fingers knew where to go, and technically there was nothing to criticize. But Marvin listened to the first verse and felt it immediately. The absence. The song was there, but what the song was about wasn't. Mercy. Mercy Me wasn't about chord shapes. It was about standing at the edge of something ruined and not being able to look away. Jimmy was playing the surface of it, clean and careful, and in doing so, he was missing the only thing that mattered. The room applauded when Jimmy finished. Genuine warmth. He was likable, and people wanted him to succeed. Then a man in a dark suit walked to the front of the room. Leonard Cole, Lenny to the people who worked with him, though few used it warmly, was 38 years old and had spent the last decade moving between New York and Detroit, telling people what the music industry needed. He worked A&R for a label that wasn't Motown. He was the kind of man who read the trades before he read the room and never fully understood why that was a problem. He gave Jimmy a nod. Good playing, man. Clean changes. A pause that lasted one beat too long. But soul music isn't really about clean changes, is it? It's about something you either have or you don't. The room went slightly uncomfortable. Jimmy looked down at his guitar. Lenny kept going, the way men like him always do. The thing about a song like Mercy, Mercy Me is that it's asking you to feel something specific, something broken, and that's hard to fake. In fact, you can't fake it. The audience always knows. He smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks he's being generous by being honest. Keep working, that's all. Then from the corner, quietly enough that only the few nearest tables heard it first, the bridge. Lenny turned. In the dim light near the wall, the man in the knit cap hadn't moved. He was still sitting low in his chair, drink in hand, eyes steady. The bridge is supposed to crack, he said. The voice has to break there. That's not an accident. That's where the grief lives. Lenny looked at him for a moment, the slightly tilted head, the measured tone. He knew this type. Music rooms were full of them. Men who sat in corners and collected opinions like other men collected records. He smiled, polite mostly. That's an interesting note, he said into the mic, loud enough for the room to hear. Soul music is dead, some people say, because everyone's an expert and nobody's an artist. But hey, He opened one hand toward the stage. If our friend in the corner really knows where the grief lives, the mic is right here. A few people laughed. Not cruelly, just the way people laugh when something lands and they're not sure if they should. The man in the corner said nothing. He looked at Lenny for one flat second, then looked back at his drink. The door opened. Curtis Mayfield walked in the way Curtis always walked. Unhurried, composed, like the world had agreed to wait for him. He was coming off the Superfly sessions, passing through Detroit on his way back to Chicago. He stood just inside the doorway while his eyes adjusted to the light. Then his gaze landed on the man sitting alone in the corner. Curtis stood still for a moment. Then he walked over, sat down in the empty chair across from him, and said nothing for almost 10 full seconds. Marvin Gaye is sitting in the corner of a 40-seat club, and nobody in this room knows. Marvin looked at him. Curtis, you want to tell me what just happened up there? Curtis nodded toward the front, where Lenny was writing something in a small notebook. Marvin told him, briefly, the young kid, the song, the comment, the invitation. Curtis listened. When Marvin finished, he leaned back and looked at the stage for a long moment. Then he said, so a man who has never written anything that matters just told the man who wrote Mercy, Mercy Me that he doesn't know where the grief lives. Into a microphone. In public. Marvin exhaled slowly. He doesn't know who I am. That's not the point, Curtis said. That's actually the opposite of the point. The room had moved on. Lenny was calling the next name on his list. Jimmy Watkins was sitting at a small table near the stage with his Telecaster across his lap, looking at the floor the way young musicians look at the floor when they're deciding whether or not to keep going. Curtis looked at Marvin, not pushing him, just looking. You going to let him stand up there and tell this room where the grief doesn't live? Marvin didn't answer right away. He set his glass down. He pulled the knit cap off his head and put it in his coat pocket. He sat with that for a moment, just sat with it, and then he stood up. He didn't say anything to Curtis. He didn't need to. He walked toward the stage slowly, and the first person to notice was the bartender, who stopped pretending to wipe the glass. By the time Marvin reached the edge of the stage, maybe a third of the room had gone quiet for reasons they couldn't name yet. Just that instinct that sometimes arrives before understanding does. He stepped up. The stage was small and the spotlight wasn't built for this. There was a microphone on a stand and a battered Fender Rhodes off to one side that someone had left from earlier in the night. Marvin sat down at it. He touched one key, just one, held it until it faded. Then he began playing the opening of Mercy, Mercy Me, and something in the room shifted immediately. Not because anything dramatic happened, because the opposite of something dramatic happened. The space got quiet, the particular kind of quiet where people forget they're in public. When Marvin's voice came in, it was low, almost conversational at first, like he was telling someone something in a room with no one else in it. He sang the first verse and it was precise, every note where it belonged. But there was something underneath it that hadn't been there when Jimmy played it. A weight, the kind that doesn't come from practice, the kind that comes from standing in certain rooms and being unable to leave. Lenny Cole had turned away from his notebook. He was looking at the stage, and his expression was going through several changes in the span of a few seconds. First, a vague recognition that something was different, then attention, then the beginning of something he hadn't expected to feel in a 40-seat room on a Tuesday night. The bridge arrived. Marvin's voice changed, just slightly, just enough. There was a crack in it that wasn't a mistake. It was exactly the thing he'd described from across the room 20 minutes ago. The voice breaking where it's supposed to break, because the song is about something real, and real things don't hold together perfectly at the seams. That crack was the entire point. That crack was what Jimmy hadn't been able to find, and what Lenny Cole had just finished explaining to the room that he understood. Lenny Cole was not talking. Lenny Cole was standing with his notebook hanging at his side and his mouth not quite closed, and he was hearing something he didn't know how to file into any category he'd spent 10 years building for himself. Marvin finished. He didn't draw it out. He brought the song home the way it was supposed to go home, with the last note leaving space for something, not filling it. The blue note went silent. 5 seconds, maybe more. Then someone started clapping, and within moments, everyone in the room was on their feet. Not because they'd agreed to, Not because the moment demanded a reaction, but because that's what happens when something true moves through a room and you don't have a better response. Jimmy Watkins was standing. His hands were shaking slightly, the way hands shake when the body understands something before the mind catches up. Lenny Cole walked toward the stage. He didn't have his notebook anymore. He stopped at the edge and looked up, and whatever he'd planned to say still hadn't arrived. Marvin looked at him calmly. "The grief lives in the crack," he said. "You can't instruct someone to find it. You can only show them where to look." He stepped off the stage. He walked to where Jimmy Watkins was sitting. The young man opened his mouth and closed it again. Marvin looked at him for a moment. "Play it again tomorrow night," he said. "Don't try to find the crack. Just remember something real. The crack finds you." Jimmy nodded. There was nothing else to say. Curtis was already by the door, coat on, hands in his pockets. When Marvin reached him, Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then, "You just ate that man's entire argument in 4 minutes." Marvin put his cap back on. "I wasn't trying to." "I know," Curtis said. "That's what made it worse for him." They walked out onto Hastings Street into the cold Detroit air. Two men who had just come from somewhere else entirely and were headed somewhere no one would recognize them either. And that was fine. Recognition wasn't the point tonight. The point was the crack in the bridge. The point was where the grief lives. Lenny Cole stood inside the Blue Note for a long time after they left. Not because he didn't know where to go, because he'd just heard something he was going to spend the rest of his career trying to find a word for, and he already understood, somewhere deep and uncomfortable, that he wasn't going to find it. Have you ever stood in a room and heard something that changed the size of everything you thought you knew? Drop it in the comments. We want to hear it.